When U.S. Army Captain Daniel Ross retired after 12 years of service, all he wanted was peace and a quiet place to start over. So he found an abandoned wooden cabin deep in the Wyoming forest, being sold for just $500. Everyone laughed and called it cursed. Locals claimed the cabin was haunted, that anyone who stayed there heard voices, footsteps, and sometimes saw shadows moving where no one stood. But Daniel wasn't afraid. He had survived war zones. What could a wooden cabin possibly do? He bought it anyway, thinking he could fix it, flip it, maybe retire there someday. But the moment he opened the door, his battle-trained German shepherd, Shadow, refused to go inside. Ears up, body shaking, staring into an empty corner as if something invisible were standing there. That night, heavy footsteps began walking across the cabin roof, then down the walls, even though the nearest neighbor was 30 miles away. Still, none of that compared to what happened next, when Shadow dug under the porch and uncovered a hidden hatch the government had sealed for over 40 years. What Captain Ross found inside that bunker was so shocking. It changed everything. Stay with us. This incredible story will leave you stunned. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Captain Daniel Ross had spent 12 long years serving the United States Army, moving from one battlefield to another, carrying responsibility heavier than the gear on his back. He had seen things most people never would, decisions made in seconds, friends lost in moments, and even though he returned home with medals pinned to his chest, something inside him had changed forever. People saw a hero. But Daniel knew the truth: war never really left anyone. It followed quietly, like a shadow clinging to the edges of memory. Some nights he woke up breathless, hearing echoes that weren't real. Some days, loud noises made his heart race. His dog, Shadow, a loyal German shepherd trained with him during missions, was the only one who noticed every small tremble in his hands. After retiring, Daniel tried living in the city for a while. But the noise, the rush, the crowds, all of it felt suffocating. He needed silence, something peaceful, something untouched by the world he wanted to leave behind. Every time he drove past the countryside, watching tall trees sway against the wind, he felt a strange pull inside him, as if the forest was offering him a place to breathe again. Shadow felt it too. The moment Daniel stepped out of the car during one of his quiet drives, the dog would run ahead, tail high, ears pointed, as if saying, "This is where you belong." One evening, sitting alone in his small apartment, Daniel opened his laptop and typed without really thinking. Cabins for sale in quiet areas. Dozens of listings appeared, most too expensive, some too damaged, some too close to towns. None of them felt right, until one did. A tiny wooden cabin hidden deep inside the Wyoming forest. The picture was old, the walls looked worn, and the roof seemed tired after so many winters. But the place had something the others didn't quite, a stillness you could feel even through the screen. And then Daniel's eyes narrowed as he saw the price. $500. That was it. He blinked, thinking it was a mistake. No cabin, no matter how old, sold for that low, especially not one sitting in a forest that looked so peaceful. But the listing was real. No details, no description. Just one short line at the bottom. Sold as is. No guarantees. Daniel felt curiosity rise inside him. Shadow lifted his head too, as if sensing a change. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this cabin was about to pull him into the strangest chapter of his life, one far more mysterious than any battlefield he had ever seen. The next morning, Daniel couldn't shake the image of that old cabin from his mind. Something about it felt unfinished, like a story waiting to be told. He printed the listing, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his jacket pocket before heading out on a long drive to Wyoming, Shadow resting quietly in the back seat. The road stretched endlessly between towering pine trees. Patches of snow still clung to the ground, sparkling under the pale winter sun. The deeper they drove into the forest, the more peaceful it became. No cars, no voices, just the steady hum of the engine and the soft rustle of wind. Finally, the GPS announced the location, but there was no cabin in sight, only a small gas station with an old wooden sign creaking in the wind. Daniel stopped to ask for directions. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled. A handful of locals sat scattered around, But when they saw him in his military jacket, silence settled over the room. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with sharp, watchful eyes. His gray beard matched the frost outside. Daniel approached him with the printed listing. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "I'm trying to find this cabin. It's listed for sale $500. The old man didn't look at the paper for long. His expression shifted instantly, surprise first, then concern, then something darker. "You're planning to buy that place?" he asked slowly. Daniel nodded. "Why? Is there something wrong with it?" One of the men sitting nearby let out a nervous chuckle. "Wrong? Son, that cabin's been empty for more than 40 years. Folks around here don't go near it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Haunted?" he guessed, half joking. No one laughed. Instead, the room grew unusually still. The old man leaned forward. People who stayed there didn't stay long. They heard things. "What things?" Daniel asked. "Voices, knocking, sometimes footsteps inside when no one else was around." Another man added quietly, "Last owner ran out in the middle of the night, never came back for his belongings." Shadow, who had been sniffing the floor near Daniel's feet, suddenly let out a low growl, deep, warning, instinctive. The locals exchanged glances. Daniel placed a calming hand on his dog's back. "Look, I appreciate the warnings, but I've seen enough in my life that stories don't scare me. I just want a quiet place." The old man sighed, as if he already knew Daniel wouldn't be convinced. "If you're set on going, follow the trail behind the station. About 2 miles in, you'll see it, but listen to me whatever you hear inside. Don't ignore it." Daniel folded the paper again, nodded respectfully, and headed out. Shadow hesitated at the door, looking back at the locals who watched them leave with uneasy eyes. Daniel started the engine. The forest road ahead looked darker now, heavier somehow, but he shook off the feeling. Haunted or not, a cabin was just wood and stone. At least, that's what he believed then. He had no idea how wrong he was. The forest trail behind the gas station was narrower than Daniel expected, covered in patches of snow and scattered pine needles. As he drove deeper, the trees closed in around the truck like silent guards. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Shadow sat upright in the back seat, ears sharp, nose twitching at every new scent drifting through the cracked window. After almost 15 minutes, the trees suddenly parted, and there it was, the cabin. Small, old, and lonely. Its wooden logs had faded into a dull gray, the chimney stones looked chipped, and the roof carried patches of green moss. It didn't look dangerous. It didn't look haunted. It just looked forgotten. Daniel stepped out of the truck, crunching through snow. The air was still, the kind of silence that felt almost unnatural. "Shadow, come on," he called, but Shadow didn't move. The German shepherd stood frozen in the back seat, staring at the cabin with an intensity Daniel had never seen before. His fur bristled along his spine, his ears pinned back. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, soft but unmistakable. "Hey," Daniel said gently, walking to the door. "It's just an old house." Shadow slowly stepped down, paws landing softly on the snow. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he simply circled Daniel, positioning himself between his owner and the cabin door, as if trying to block the way. Daniel frowned. Shadow was trained to detect danger, hidden explosives, traps, ambush threats, and he had always trusted the dog's instincts. But this was a cabin, empty, silent. To prove it, Daniel walked toward the front porch. Shadow followed, reluctantly, head low, nose sniffing aggressively. The wooden steps creaked under Daniel's boots. He reached for the door handle, but Shadow suddenly barked, short, sharp, and full of alarm. Daniel turned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow's gaze was glued to the dark crack at the base of the door. His body stiffened, one paw slightly raised, a classic sign he sensed something moving inside. Daniel crouched down, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, just the faint rustle of trees behind them. Still, Shadow refused to enter. Daniel opened the door slowly. The hinges groaned. A cold draft swept out, carrying a stale, dusty smell. Inside, the cabin was dim. Old furniture covered in sheets. A broken chair lying sideways. Cobwebs tangled in the corners. Nothing unusual. But Shadow stayed rooted on the porch, tail low, teeth slightly visible. "Shadow," Daniel whispered. a strange uneasiness creeping into his voice. "What are you sensing?" The dog's eyes didn't blink. He kept staring into the cabin's darkness as if something or someone was standing just beyond where Daniel could see. A chill ran through Daniel's spine. Shadow had never reacted like this before. Not once. Not even in war zones. For the first time since seeing the listing, Daniel felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe the locals were right. Maybe this cabin wasn't just old. Maybe it was hiding something. Daniel didn't stay long inside the cabin that first day. Shadow's refusal to step over the threshold bothered him more than he wanted to admit. After taking a quick look around, he locked the door and drove back to the small town a few miles away. He needed supplies, food, tools, maybe some cleaning items, but deep down, he also wanted answers. Inside the town's only general store, the same uneasy silence greeted him as before. People glanced at him, at the dirt on his boots, at the faint snow melting on his jacket. They knew exactly where he had been. The old shopkeeper from the gas station stood behind the counter. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked without lifting his eyes. Daniel placed a few items on the counter. "The cabin? Yes. It's old, but it's nothing unusual. Just needs repairs." The shopkeeper finally looked at him and shook his head. "You still don't understand." Daniel frowned. "Then explain it to me." A moment of heavy silence passed before the man leaned forward. "That cabin didn't get empty because people moved away. It got empty because people disappeared." Daniel's breath caught. "Disappeared? As in, missing?" The man nodded slowly. 40, maybe 50 years ago, a family lived there. Husband, wife, and their young daughter. One winter night, neighbors heard screams. When they came to check, the door was wide open. Fire still burning in the fireplace. Dinner on the table. But the family, he snapped his fingers. Gone. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry, no bodies ever found. Daniel tried to stay rational. There must have been an explanation. There wasn't. The shopkeeper's voice grew quiet, and they weren't the only ones. A trapper found the cabin years later and tried living there. Lasted 3 nights. He ran out at dawn, barefoot in the snow, raving about whispers inside the walls. Another customer nearby added, "My uncle used to patrol those woods. Said he'd see a light in the cabin window, even when the place was locked." Daniel felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Shadow hadn't reacted to dusty furniture or creaking wood. He had reacted to danger. Real danger. "Why sell it for $500 then?" Daniel asked. The shopkeeper gave a helpless shrug. "Because no one wants it. It's been abandoned for decades. Land office tried tearing it down once, but workers refused. Said the place felt wrong." Daniel stood quietly, absorbing every word. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in instincts, especially shadows. What exactly had happened in that cabin? And what was still hiding inside it? By the time Daniel returned to the cabin, the sky had already slipped into shades of deep blue. The sun dipped behind the trees, leaving the forest in a cold, silent stillness. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, settling on the porch. Shadow stepped out of the truck cautiously, nose low, sniffing every inch of ground before taking a single step forward. Daniel unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. The stale, dusty smell from earlier still lingered, but he ignored it. He set his supplies on the old wooden table, then lit the fireplace. Warm orange flames slowly filled the room, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Shadow stayed alert, pacing the cabin perimeter, sniffing corners, occasionally stopping to stare at the ceiling as if something moved above them. Daniel shook his head. "Relax, boy. It's just an old roof creaking." But Shadow didn't relax. After setting up a simple sleeping bag near the fireplace, Daniel sat down with a sigh. The warmth helped, but fatigue weighed heavily on him. Shadow curled beside him, though not fully resting. His ears twitched at every little noise. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls like whispering fingers. The fire crackled softly. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe the warnings were exaggerated, old town legends twisted over time. Then, sometime past midnight, everything changed. A sharp sound echoed above them. Thump. Shadow leapt to his feet immediately, hackles rising, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Daniel straightened, eyes darting upward. What was that? Before he could react, another sound followed, slow, deliberate, heavy, thump, 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 footsteps on the roof. Daniel froze. It wasn't the random creaking of old wood. It wasn't falling branches. These were steps measured, paced like someone walking directly above them. Shadow barked once, sharp and warning. He positioned himself between Daniel and the door, muscles tense, ready to attack whatever came through. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and moved cautiously toward the front door. He opened it slowly. The cold air hit him instantly. He shone the beam across the roof, scanning every angle. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No sign of movement. Only falling snow, soft and innocent. He stepped outside a few paces, narrowing his eyes. "Is someone out there?" he called into the woods. Silence answered him. Not even the wind replied. Then, behind him inside the cabin, Shadow barked wildly. Daniel spun around, heart jolting. Shadow stood rigid near the fireplace, staring at the ceiling as if tracking something moving above them. Daniel stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. And then the footsteps started again, but this time, they moved. From one end of the roof, across the cabin, and then to the back wall. Shadow followed the sounds with his body, growling, pacing with the movement as if something was circling them. Daniel felt his pulse pounding in his ears. "Okay, breathe. Stay calm," he whispered to himself. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew slower, heavier, almost dragging. The sound pressed down through the ceiling, as if the weight above them was too much for the rotten wood to hold. Just when Daniel reached for his jacket to go outside again, the footsteps abruptly stopped. Complete silence, as if whoever, whatever, had been up there knew he was listening. Daniel looked at Shadow, who remained tense, staring intently at the ceiling. "Shadow," he whispered, "what are we dealing with here?" The dog didn't blink. His growl faded into a low, uneasy whine, like he sensed something neither of them could understand. Daniel sat down slowly, the fire crackling behind him. He forced himself to breathe steadily, but inside, a truth he didn't want to accept began pressing into his thoughts. This wasn't creaking wood. It wasn't wildlife. It was steps, human steps, steps that traveled across the whole roof without leaving a single trace in the snow. Daniel stared at the dark ceiling long into the night, and for the first time since arriving, he wondered if he had made a mistake coming here. The footsteps eventually faded into silence, but sleep never came. Daniel lay awake beside the dying fire, listening to every crack of wood, every sigh of wind pressing against the windows. Shadow, exhausted from hours of alertness, finally settled down, yet even in rest, the dog kept his ears perked, ready to react at the slightest sound. Sometime near dawn, the cabin grew unbearably cold. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint orange cinders glowing beneath the ash. Daniel wrapped his jacket tighter around himself and reached to throw another log onto the flames. That's when Shadow suddenly jerked awake. His head snapped toward the far corner of the room, a shadowed section near a cabinet covered with dust. His eyes focused, sharp and unblinking. Then he stood, slowly, shoulders stiff, tail lowered, every muscle in his body drawn tight. Daniel whispered, "What is it now?" Shadow didn't growl. He didn't bark. Instead, he walked toward the corner with cautious steps, nose pressed nearly to the floor. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and followed. The corner looked ordinary. An old bookshelf, a dusty chair missing one leg. Nothing unusual. But Shadow stopped at the wall and began sniffing it intensely, moving his nose back and forth along the wood. Then, without warning, he lifted his paw and scratched once, twice, again. Daniel stepped closer. "Easy, boy. There's nothing there." But Shadow didn't stop. He scratched harder, his claws scraping against the wooden planks. The sound echoed through the silent cabin. His breathing became faster, louder, as if something behind that wall had grabbed his full attention. Daniel crouched down, shining the flashlight carefully. That's when he saw them. Claw marks. Old claw marks, deep, uneven, and scattered all across the bottom of the wall. Not made by Shadow. These marks were aged, carved into the wood long before he arrived. Daniel leaned in, tracing one with his finger. The grooves were rough, torn into the wood with desperate force. No animal would scratch that low against a wall, not unless trapped. His heart thudded in his chest. What happened here? Shadow growled softly, lowering his head. pushing his nose against one particular section of the wall. Daniel noticed a faint crack, thin but straight, running down the plank. He pressed his hand against it. The wood shifted slightly. A hidden panel? Daniel stood and grabbed a small tool from his bag. He slid the flat end into the crack and pried gently. The wood creaked, resisting at first, then suddenly loosened. A small piece came free, revealing darkness behind it. Shadow took a step back, ears up, tail dropping even lower. Daniel brought the flashlight closer. Behind the thin wall was a narrow cavity, small, dark, and lined with more scratches. Something or someone had tried clawing their way out. A chill ran through his spine. He whispered to himself, "This is not normal." Shadow suddenly barked, sharp and urgent, startling Daniel. The dog's gaze shifted upward toward the wall, higher than where the scratches were. Daniel followed the beam of the flashlight. At the very top, faintly etched into the wood, were letters. Shaky, uneven, almost carved in fear. "Let me out." Daniel stepped back, breath frozen in his chest. The words looked old, very old. The edges splintered, the wood discolored. Whatever had happened here had happened decades ago. Shadow pressed against Daniel's leg, trembling faintly, not from fear, but from warning. This wasn't just a haunted cabin. Someone had been trapped inside this room. Someone had tried to escape. And the worst part? Daniel realized the scratches didn't look like they were made from the outside trying to get in. They were carved from the inside, trying to get out. Daniel barely slept after discovering the scratched message in the wall. When the sun finally rose, faint light slipped through the dusty windows, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. The cabin felt different now, heavier, colder, as if the shadows had been waiting for him to wake up. Shadow stayed close, pacing restlessly. The dog kept glancing toward the fireplace, ears pulled back, body tense. At first, Daniel thought the dog simply felt uneasy from the long night, but Shadow's focus didn't waver. Every few minutes, he walked up to the hearth, sniffed the stones, then growled low under his breath. Daniel knelt beside him. "What now, boy? What do you smell?" Shadow pushed his nose between two loose stones near the base of the fireplace and pawed at them. Daniel frowned. He hadn't noticed anything unusual there before. The stones looked old, soot-stained, but otherwise normal. But Shadow kept pawing, more urgently this time. Daniel placed a hand on one of the stones. It shifted. His pulse quickened. He tested another stone beside it. It shifted too. The entire lower section wasn't built solidly like the rest. It was deliberately arranged to look permanent, yet loose enough to move with pressure. "Someone hid something here," Daniel muttered under his breath. Shadow backed up slightly, tail straight, eyes locked on the stones like he expected something to crawl out. Daniel grabbed a metal tool from his supplies and wedged it between the loose stones. One by one, he pried them out, placing them gently onto the floor. Dust spilled out with each stone removed, filling the air with a dry, choking smell. Behind the stones, darkness began to form a black square opening, no bigger than a small crawl space. Daniel leaned closer, shining his flashlight inside. His breath caught. There was a hidden compartment, long, narrow, and built into the very foundation of the cabin. It must have been sealed for decades. Cobwebs hung like broken curtains. Dust coated every inch. But something else caught his eye. Objects. A small metal box. A torn piece of fabric. A glass jar with something sealed inside. And farther back, something that looked like a notebook. The air inside the compartment felt colder than the rest of the cabin, and the smell, damp, metallic, almost bitter, made Daniel's skin prickle. He reached in slowly. Shadow barked, loud and sudden, as if warning him. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it. His fingers wrapped around the small metal box first. It was old, army style, dented and rusted at the edges. He set it aside and reached deeper, grabbing the notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, the edges chewed, almost like an animal had tried to tear it. Daniel flipped it open. What he saw wasn't random notes or household entries. It was writing, detailed writing. The journal of someone who had lived or hidden inside this cabin long before he arrived. Shadow let out a soft whine, nudging Daniel's arm. Because the first words inside the journal weren't just notes. They were a warning. "If you're reading this, I hope you're not too late." Daniel felt chills crawl up his spine. Whatever happened in this cabin wasn't just rumor. Someone had documented it. And now, Daniel was about to uncover the truth buried for decades. Daniel sat on the cabin floor, the journal resting in his hands like a fragile artifact pulled from a grave. Shadow stayed pressed against his side, refusing to move even an inch away from the fireplace opening. The air inside the cabin felt colder now, sharper, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to turn the page. The first entry was dated 1979. Daniel cleared his throat and began to read. Day 1. They told me this assignment would be temporary, surveillance only. But something is wrong here. The forest is too quiet. Even the animals avoid this place. Daniel blinked. Surveillance? Assignment? This wasn't the journal of an ordinary homeowner. He turned the page. Day 3. At night I hear footsteps on the roof. The officers say it's my imagination. But I know what footsteps sound like, and these are not human. A chill crawled down Daniel's back. He remembered the sounds from the previous night, the steady thumping that traveled above him. Shadow let out a low growl, as if the memory bothered him too. Daniel read the next entry. Day 6. The voices started. At first they whispered my name. Now they knock on the walls, always from inside the wood. I'm not supposed to break protocol, but I am terrified. Inside the wood. Daniel glanced toward the scratched message on the wall. Let me out. His stomach tightened. The next entry was written messier, rushed, like the soldier's hand had been shaking. Day 9, I found the hidden room today, behind the fireplace. There were claw marks everywhere. Something was here before me. Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He forced himself to continue. Day 10, command won't answer my calls. They told me not to leave the cabin. Why? What do they know about this place? Daniel inhaled slowly. This soldier wasn't missing by accident. Something had happened here that someone didn't want exposed. Shadow suddenly stood, ears sharpening, gaze fixed on the window as if he sensed movement outside. Daniel rested a calming hand on him, though his own nerves were frayed. He turned another page. Day 12. I'm not alone anymore. At night something moves under the floorboards. The roof creaks with weight that shouldn't be there. If I disappear, it wasn't the forest. Daniel swallowed hard. The final entry stopped him cold. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, almost unreadable, written in fear or pain. Day 14. They used this cabin for experiments during the Cold War. Psychological testing, isolation, sensory torture. They said it was for national security, but the subjects didn't die. They changed, and now they live in the walls. If anyone finds this, leave. Burn this place. Don't try to save me. The last sentence was smeared, as if the soldier's hand had dragged across wet ink. Daniel closed the journal slowly. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Every instinct he had learned in the military screamed at him. This place wasn't just haunted. It was dangerous. Shadow nudged his arm, whining softly. The dog's nose was pointed toward the crawl space behind the fireplace, as if he sensed something still lingering inside. Something the soldier never escaped from. Daniel stared at the compartment, the darkness inside it stretching deeper than before. The soldier had warned him to leave, but Daniel realized something far worse. The soldier never wrote an entry saying he left the cabin. And now, Daniel feared he might discover why. Daniel set the soldier's journal down carefully, as if he feared it might crumble in his hands. The words inside it echoed through his mind like distant gunfire, sharp, unavoidable, impossible to ignore. Experiments, surveillance, subjects that didn't die. Nothing about this place was simple anymore. The cabin wasn't cheap because it was old. It was cheap because someone wanted it forgotten. Shadow paced the room, nose twitching, occasionally stopping near the walls as if he could hear something Daniel couldn't. The dog wasn't just nervous, he was tracking, searching. Daniel pulled the metal box out of the crawl space where he had found the journal. His fingers brushed over the rusted lid. It felt heavier than it looked. Carefully, he pried it open. Inside were military tags, a faded photograph, and rolled documents sealed with brittle tape. The dog tags read, Corporal James H. Mercer, the missing soldier. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his throat. Mercer had been real. A man with a name, a mission, and a fate no one ever reported. He picked up the photograph next. It showed 3 men in uniform standing outside the very same cabin. Though in the picture, the logs looked newer, the roof intact, the forest behind them undisturbed. One of the men was Mercer. Another was a stern-faced officer Daniel recognized from old military archives. The third man, Daniel didn't know, but something about his expression felt unsettling, as if he wasn't supposed to be photographed at all. Daniel unrolled the documents next. They were brittle, yellowed with age, but the headings were still visible. Operation Silencer, Psychological Endurance Trials. Phase 2 Protocol, Extended Isolation, Subject Containment Procedures. Daniel felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a simple surveillance post. The cabin had been a controlled site, an experiment room disguised as an ordinary forest home. The subjects they tested weren't volunteers. The notes described them as acquired individuals, monitored for behavioral breakdowns under severe isolation. One line chilled him more than anything. If auditory hallucinations intensify, containment breaches may occur. Breaches. The scratches on the wall. The message, "Let me out." The footsteps on the roof. The soldiers' warnings. It all connected. Shadow suddenly growled deep, protective, his body pointing toward the kitchen floorboards. Daniel turned sharply. The dog's stance was rigid, one paw lifted, tail stiff. He was detecting something beneath them. Daniel knelt, pressing his ear against the wooden floor. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then, a faint thud. Slow, heavy, rhythmic, like someone moving deep underground. Daniel jerked back, heart racing. There was more to this cabin. More than the hidden room, more than the journal, more than the broken past buried in documents. Something was still active beneath them. The soldier had written, "They live in the walls." But what if they didn't stay there? What if they had moved deeper? What if they never left the bunker he hinted at? Shadow barked once, alarmed, insistent. Daniel's breath grew unsteady. The government didn't abandon this cabin because it was haunted. They abandoned it because they couldn't contain what they created. The thudding beneath the floorboards echoed through the cabin like a heartbeat, slow, distant, and unmistakably real. Daniel froze, his mind racing. The journal, the claw marks, the soldiers' warnings, everything suddenly took on a sharper meaning. Whatever had happened here hadn't ended in the 1,970 seconds. Something was still moving. Shadow growled again, louder this time. His fur stood up along his spine as he moved toward the back door. Not toward the fireplace, not toward the hidden compartment. Toward the outside. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and followed. The cold air rushed into the cabin as he opened the door. Shadow bounded onto the porch, nose to the ground, scanning the surroundings with a soldier's instinct. "Show me," Daniel whispered. Shadow led him around the side of the cabin. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they approached the porch steps. The dog suddenly stopped, head raised, ears pointed sharply forward. He sniffed once, twice, then dug his paws into the frozen ground near the wooden support beams. At first, Daniel didn't understand. Then he saw it. A patch of earth slightly sunken, the snow thinner there. The soil disturbed in a way that didn't match the rest of the untouched forest floor. Shadow started digging furiously. "Easy, Shadow. Slow down," Daniel said, kneeling beside him. The dog ignored him and kept scraping away, throwing chunks of dirt behind him. The soil came up too quickly, too loose for winter ground, as if someone, or something, had disturbed this area recently. Within minutes, Shadow uncovered a wooden plank buried beneath the dirt. Daniel brushed the remaining soil away with his gloves. It wasn't a plank. It was a hatch. Old metal hinges peeked out from the edges, rusted but unmistakably functional. Someone had hidden an entrance, intentionally buried it beneath layers of soil. Daniel felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He grabbed the metal handle and tugged. The hatch didn't budge. Shadow barked, pacing restlessly beside him. Daniel braced both hands against it and pulled harder. A crack echoed in the cold air as the hatch finally lifted. Beneath it lay darkness deep, black, and unnervingly cold. A narrow ladder descended into the earth, swallowed by shadow. A faint smell drifted up, dust, metal, and something else. Something stale, like air trapped for decades. Daniel aimed his flashlight down the hole. A tunnel. A long, narrow tunnel, stretching beyond the reach of light. Shadow growled softly, the sound trembling in the cold air. He didn't move away, but he didn't step forward either. He knew danger was below them. Real danger. Daniel took a deep breath. Okay, he whispered. We're doing this together. He climbed down the ladder slowly, shadow whining above him. When his boots hit the ground, the tunnel floor felt uneven, a mixture of dirt and crumbling concrete. The walls were reinforced with old wooden beams, many split and rotting. Shadow finally jumped down beside him, landing silently. The tunnel stretched forward like a throat, swallowing their light the farther they walked. Daniel moved cautiously, flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. Shadow stayed ahead, muscles tight, ears flicking at every distant sound. After several minutes, the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Daniel's breath caught. The ceiling arched above him with rusted metal pipes. Old wiring hung like dead vines. On one side stood a corroded metal door, its frame covered in warning labels, barely readable through the rust. He approached slowly, shining the light across its surface. Words appeared under the grime. Restricted Area Bunker 11. Authorized personnel only. And beneath that, a chilling line. Last sealed, Feb 1979. Daniel stepped back. Shadow whimpered, tail low, staring at the door as if expecting it to move. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was an entrance to the very bunker the missing soldier had written about, the place where the experiments took place. The bunker no one was ever supposed to find. Daniel placed a hand on the cold metal, swallowing hard. Everything about this place screamed danger, but the truth was buried behind this door, and he had already come too far to turn back. The metal door loomed in front of Daniel, like the mouth of something ancient and hungry. Rust crawled along its edges, flaking off in thin red powder. Shadow stood stiff beside him, growling low, not aggressively, but in warning. The dog knew. He always knew. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight and grabbed the wheel handle fixed to the door. It was icy, stiff from decades of silence. He braced his foot against the frame and twisted with all the strength he had. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, clank. The lock shifted. A slow, painful groan echoed as the door cracked open. Cold, stale air spilled out, carrying a metallic scent that made Daniel's stomach turn. The inside was pitch black, thicker than the darkness of the tunnel. It felt heavy, almost alive. Shadow refused to enter at first. His ears flattened, his tail tucked slightly. But when Daniel stepped inside, the dog followed because he always followed. Daniel swept the flashlight across the bunker. What he saw froze him. Rows of metal desks covered with equipment, long dead monitors, tangled wires, broken headsets. A wall lined with shelves filled with tape reels and storage boxes labeled classified. A cracked glass panel that once separated observation from experimentation. Everything was coated in dust, untouched since the day the bunker was sealed. Daniel moved deeper. On the far desk, a stack of files lay scattered, some open, some half buried under debris. He picked one up carefully. The first page read, Subject 4, Response to Isolation, Escalation Level Critical. He flipped through more papers. Handwritten notes, charts, heart rate logs, behavior observations. One sentence stopped him cold. Subject reports hearing voices in the walls, claims something is watching from vents. Daniel clenched the file, swallowing hard. Shadow nudged his leg, whining softly. The dog's gaze locked on a metal door at the far end of the bunker. Small, square, bolted shut from the outside. Daniel noticed claw marks along the edge. Deep ones, frantic ones, the same kind he found inside the cabin. His breath hitched. Dear God. He approached the smaller door, flashlight trembling in his hand. Beside it, faded words were stenciled onto the wall. Containment hold. Shadow barked sharply, startling Daniel. The bark echoed through the bunker, bouncing off metal walls like a warning shot. Daniel stepped back, uneasy. He turned toward another table, where an old projector sat. Next to it, a single videotape rested in a cracked case. Mercer last log. James Mercer, the soldier, who vanished. Hands shaking, Daniel placed the tape into the dusty projector and flipped the switch. To his surprise, the machine flickered to life, humming weakly as the screen lit up with static. Then, the image appeared. Mercer sat in front of the camera, unshaven, eyes wide and haunted. His uniform was dirty, torn at the sleeve. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. He leaned closer to the lens. Whoever finds this, he whispered, voice trembling. It's not the isolation. It's not the hunger. It's not the fear. He looked over his shoulder suddenly, as if hearing something behind him. It's them, he said. They're still here. In the walls, in the vents. They don't die. They don't stop. Shadow started barking again, this time at the vents along the bunker ceiling. Mercer's final words sent a shiver through Daniel's bones. Don't open the containment door. Don't try to help whoever calls from inside. It's not human anymore. The tape ended abruptly. The bunker fell silent. Daniel stood frozen, flashlight shaking in his grip. Shadow pressed against his leg, trembling with instinctive fear. This wasn't just a forgotten bunker. It was a tomb, holding secrets that were never meant to be found. The projector clicked off, leaving Daniel and Shadow in a suffocating silence broken only by the faint hum of old wires overhead. The air inside the bunker felt thicker now, pressing against Daniel's chest as if the walls themselves were leaning in. Mercer's terrified voice still echoed in his mind. Don't open the containment door. Don't answer anyone calling from inside. Shadow paced anxiously, growling at the vents as if expecting something to slither out. Daniel forced himself to focus. There had to be more. Something Mercer left behind. Something that explained how everything had gone so horribly wrong. He searched the desks again, pushing aside dusty equipment and brittle papers. Then, near a toppled chair, he spotted a metal recorder, its red indicator cracked, but its tape compartment still intact. Daniel picked it up, thumb brushing across a strip of fading tape labeled Mercer Final Audio Log. His heart thudded once, heavy and slow. Shadow whimpered, ears flattening. He didn't like that recorder. Daniel didn't either. But he pressed play. Static burst from the tiny speaker, sharp and violent. Then Mercer's voice emerged quieter than before, strained, like he was whispering through clenched teeth. Day. I don't know anymore. The lights went out 2 days ago. Or maybe 3. I hear them in the tunnels. They scratch at the doors. They whisper my name. Daniel swallowed, gripping the recorder tighter. Mercer's breathing grew uneven on the tape. I was wrong to stay. We were all wrong. This cabin, this bunker, it was never meant to hold people. It was meant to trap something else. A metallic crash echoed faintly in the background of the recording, causing Shadow to flinch. Daniel felt cold sweat form along his spine. Mercer continued, his voice trembling. They experimented on the subjects to study isolation. But the isolation didn't break them. It changed them. Their minds twisted. Their bodies adapted. They crawled into the walls, into the vents, into the dark. Daniel's stomach twisted. Mercer's voice suddenly rose frantic. If anyone is hearing this, you're not alone down there. I can hear them moving. They're waiting for me to sleep. A pause. A long, shaky inhale. Then Mercer whispered something that froze Daniel's blood. I hear knocking inside the cabin floorboards. They're trying to come up. If you hear them, run. Daniel's breath caught. Shadow stared at him, eyes wide and alert because they had heard knocking. Not just once, more than once. Mercer's voice became faint, almost defeated. I'm leaving one last clue. Look under the observation table, the part they welded shut. It's the truth they hid, the truth they killed for. The tape ended with a sudden, violent sounds like scraping, and a scream cut short. Daniel lowered the recorder slowly, his hands trembling. Shadow whimpered, backing toward the tunnel entrance. The bunker felt colder, now darker, as if the very shadows remembered Mercer's final moments. But Daniel knew what he had to do next. There was something hidden under that table, something Mercer died trying to reveal. And now, Daniel would have to face whatever truth waited in the dark. Daniel didn't remember how long he stared at the spot under the observation table. Mercer's final words replayed in his head again and again, each one heavier than the last. Shadow stood rigid beside him, tail stiff, gaze fixed toward the tunnel, as if listening for something Daniel couldn't hear. But before Daniel could move the welded plate Mercer mentioned, a distant rumble shook the ground beneath the bunker. Shadow barked sharply. Daniel looked up. The rumble grew louder, vibrations rolling through the tunnel walls, sending small clouds of dust drifting from the ceiling. At first he thought it was the creature Mercer feared, but then he recognized the sound. Engines. Multiple engines. He dashed back through the bunker, gripping Shadow's collar, and climbed the ladder to the surface. As he pushed open the hatch, Blinding daylight exploded across his face, and the moment he stood upright, he froze. SUVs. 4 of them. Black, armored, government-issued. Parked around his cabin like a blockade. Men in tactical gear moved in formation, rifles slung across their chests, earpieces buzzing with coded chatter. A helicopter hovered above the treetops, circling the forest in wide loops. Shadow growled, lowering his body protectively. One of the men approached Daniel, his expression hidden behind dark glasses. "Captain Daniel Ross?" the man asked. Daniel straightened instinctively. "Yes. I'm Agent Collins. You were supposed to stay away from this property." Daniel felt anger rise. "I didn't know this place was restricted. It was listed publicly for sale." The agent's jaw tightened. "It wasn't supposed to be." He glanced at the open hatch behind Daniel. "How much have you found?" Daniel met his eyes. "Enough to know someone left a soldier here to die. Enough to know you buried more than a cabin." The agent didn't deny it. Another officer appeared beside him. "Sir, we found disturbed soil. The hatch is definitely open." Collins exhaled sharply, a mixture of frustration and resignation. "Captain, step away from the entrance. This area is classified." Daniel stood his ground. Shadow stayed pressed against his leg, a silent threat. "You need to answer what happened here," Daniel demanded. Collins removed his glasses. For the first time, Daniel saw honesty, raw, uncomfortable honesty in his eyes. 30 years ago, something went wrong," Collins said quietly. "We sealed the bunker and hoped time would bury it. But these things never stay buried, do they?" A heavy silence fell. Collins gestured, and instantly, officers surrounded Daniel. Their hands weren't hostile, but firm. "We're taking over from here," Collins said. "For your safety and everyone else's, you need to leave." Daniel looked toward the hatch, then at Shadow, then back at the agent. He knew one thing for certain. They weren't trying to protect him. They were trying to protect the secret. And Daniel had already seen too much for them to let him walk away easily. Daniel wasn't escorted far, just to the edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened. Agents moved around the cabin like a swarm, placing scanners, sealing the bunker entrance, speaking into radios with clipped, urgent voices. It was clear they weren't just recovering evidence. They were containing something. But suddenly, Shadow stiffened. His ears shot up. His body froze. His nose lifted slightly, sniffing the air with sharp, rapid breaths. Daniel knew this posture well. It was Shadow's alert stance, the same one he used in war zones moments before an explosion or ambush. "Shadow, what is it?" Daniel whispered. The dog took off toward the cabin, pulling free from Daniel's grasp. "Shadow, stop!" But Shadow didn't stop. He sprinted straight toward the bunker hatch. At that exact moment, a deafening alarm erupted from one of the agent's scanners. "Containment breach! Movement detected underground!" someone shouted. Officers panicked. Collins cursed under his breath. "Seal the hatch! Now!" But Shadow reached it first. He began barking frantically, deep, urgent, commanding. Not out of fear, but warning. The kind of bark that meant something was about to happen. Daniel rushed behind him, heart pounding. Agents moved in, surrounding them, but Shadow refused to move. He kept barking at the hatch, his paws scraping the dirt, tail raised, every muscle in his body signaling danger. Then, from beneath the ground, a new sound emerged. A scraping, a dragging, like nails pulling across metal. Officers flinched back. Collins shouted, "Stand ready!" The scraping grew louder, closer. Shadow growled, stepping in front of Daniel, as if shielding him from whatever was rising below. Then, boom! The hatch jolted upward violently, hitting the chains agents had thrown across it. Dirt exploded around them. Officers stumbled back, weapons raised. Shadow didn't move. He lunged toward the hatch, barking with all the force he had. His voice echoed across the clearing, sharp and fearless. And then the sound beneath the hatch stopped. Completely. The scanner's alarms shut off one by one. The ground went still. Collins stared at Shadow in disbelief. What? What did he do? Daniel knelt, holding Shadow's collar. He sensed it. He warned us, before it surfaced. Agents exchanged uneasy glances. One finally muttered, "We owe that dog our lives." Word spread fast, first among the team, then up the chain of command. Within hours, news outlets were parked along the forest road. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Everyone wanted to know how a retired Army captain and his dog had uncovered a Cold War secret buried for decades. But the hero wasn't Daniel. It was Shadow the dog, who sensed what machines couldn't. Shadow, who detected the danger before anyone else. Shadow, who kept something inside the bunker from breaking free. And for the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself a breath of relief. Shadow had saved lives, just as he always had. The chaos of the day didn't fade quickly. Agents worked long into the night, sealing the hatch, welding reinforced plates over the tunnel, and setting up floodlights that kept the clearing as bright as a stadium. Helicopters hovered overhead in steady rotations. Cameras flashed from behind security tape as journalists tried to document every detail. But Daniel only cared about one thing: Shadow. He sat beside his dog near the tree line, stroking his fur as Shadow finally rested his tired body. After everything they had faced, Shadow seemed calmer now, as if the forest itself had eased its breath. Agent Collins approached quietly, the weight of classified knowledge visible in his eyes. "You should know," he began. "This wasn't supposed to end like this. We never expected anyone to find that bunker again." Daniel didn't look away from Shadow. "Then why list it for sale? Why not destroy it?" Collins hesitated. "The cabin wasn't supposed to sell," he admitted. "It was a bureaucratic mistake filed among abandoned properties after decades of silence. By the time we noticed, the listing was already public." He paused before adding, "And honestly, no one believed anyone would buy a cabin in the middle of nowhere for $500. Daniel let out a dry breath. "Guess you underestimated one stubborn captain." Collins almost smiled. Almost. But then his expression sobered. "You saw things down there you weren't meant to see. Things we buried a long time ago." Operation Silencer was shut down for a reason. Daniel turned to him fully. "Because it was wrong." Collins didn't deny it. His voice softened. "Yes, it was." They stood in silence for a moment, the cold wind brushing through the trees. Finally, Collins said, "We're filing your report as a civilian discovery of hazardous material. Your name stays out of the deeper files. But the cabin," he exhaled, "it's yours. Legally. Though I'd strongly advise against rebuilding anything on this land." Daniel looked at the cabin, its fragile walls glowing under the floodlights like a ghost refusing to fade. He had come searching for peace, and instead found the darkest chapter of forgotten history. But he didn't regret it. Shadow stirred, lifting his head to look at Daniel with tired, wise eyes. Daniel gently scratched behind his ears. "You saved lives today," he whispered. Again, Shadow's tail thumped softly. Later that night, after the agents cleared the area and the forest quieted, Daniel stood alone before the cabin. Snow drifted around him like falling ash. The structure looked worn, broken, but now he understood why. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been silenced. Every scream, every scratch, every footstep on that roof, it wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by secrets, cruel ones, buried under years of lies. Daniel placed a hand on the cabin's cold wooden frame. "I'm not afraid of you," he whispered. "Not anymore." Shadow pressed beside him, warm and solid. The cabin might not be safe enough to live in, but Daniel knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't leaving it behind. He would restore the land, bring peace back to the forest, and make sure no one ever suffered under this roof again. He and Shadow had survived the darkness together. And now, for the first time, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A quiet place to breathe. A place to rebuild. Not the cabin he bought for $500, but the future he found because of a dog who never stopped protecting him